survivor of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. 74 years ago, she was there. And now I am here, and I don't know why. But today, my mission and my goal is to explore with you the narratives of 3 other survivors, including my bachang, to explore and to really go into what makes a survivor and why those narratives are so important for us today. Thank you all so much for joining me. We are living in the aftershock of Hiroshima. People are still the scars of history. This is said by Edward Bond, an English playwright. Now, World War II is remembered as the good war in our narratives. In our minds and in our history classes, the war begins with Japan's attack in Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and it ends victoriously with the Emperor's surrender in August 1945. However, reconstructing and remembering the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs at these 2 ground zeros of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are completely different narratives. The insubstantial mushroom clouds disappear, and in their place are women, children, fathers, grandparents, grandfathers with names. One of them was Margaret Oneagi, who was my grandmother. Another, Lee Jong-kun, who was a Korean living in Japan. Father Wilhelm Kleinsorg from Hiroshima, written by John Hershey, who was a German missionary, Jesuit missionary, living in Hiroshima. And the last, Howard Kakita, who was another Japanese American, only 7-year-old when the bomb dropped. These are the bombs. These are Hikabusha. In Japanese, in typical Japanese fashion, they don't call them survivors or sufferers of the atomic bomb. Rather, they are people affected by the bomb, or a person affected to the exposition to a bomb. Very verbose, very wordy, and not alluding to all the suffering, all the damage, and the physical toll that the bomb took on the people, much less the psychological toll that it took. Miyako Hara was only a youngster when the bomb dropped. And later, a decade later after, she told an interviewer, the Miyako to today is completely different from the Miyako of the past. This fracturing of identity is prevalent through many of the Hikabusha, the survivors. They were not allowed to publicly engage with the nature and the meaning of the new atomic age. The US occupational forces censored virtually all discussion of the bombs starting in September 1949, once the occupation forces arrived. This was, as in many of the censorship rhetoric by governments, they said it was in the name of preventing public unrest. They wanted to maintain control, and so all the photos, videos, stories, and survivors were censored, and they were not allowed to speak about it. The initial responses, of course, were horror, shock, and anger. Several of the most touching narratives are of the occupation forces. One, Nisei, which is a second-generation Japanese American, who was a member of the armed forces. Upon returning to Japan, visiting relatives in Hiroshima, was met with such anger, disgust, called the American murderer, that when he returned to his quarters in Tokyo, he hung himself because of how much pain he was suffering. As for the survivors themselves, when they encountered the American prisoners of war who had survived the bomb because they were in underground cells, the Hikabusha beat them to death out of anger. The Japanese initially regarded the atomic bombs as another natural disaster, or as the Buddhist hell, later realizing that the science and technology had lifted and leaped bounds further than what they had previously imagined could be possible. And soon this rage dissipated in the face of the urgent challenges of daily survival, as they were burned and suffered radiation poisoning, the likes of which had never been seen before in history. Later, the trauma of nuclear devastation and the unconditional surrender of Japan reinforced this sense of vulnerability and victimization. This victim consciousness, known as Higaisha Ikishi in Japanese, led to this perception of the war as a uniquely Japanese identity, forgetting Nanjing, Bataan, the Burma-Siam Railway, Manila, and countless of the Japanese atrocities, all in the name of these perverse national treasures, putting Hiroshima and Nagasaki as almost excuses to forget those narratives, putting the Japanese victimizers in the state of victimization themselves. Now, the narratives of those who were non-Japanese and victims of the atomic bombs as well have also been forgotten, not only in Japanese historical narratives, but also in ours. I was fascinated to learn that among the 100,000 people who died at the Hiroshima atomic bombs and Nagasaki atomic bomb, there were also around 8,000 Japanese Americans in Hiroshima and an untold number of Koreans living in Japan. The narratives I'm going to tell today are these stories. None of them are Japanese by nationality. My own grandmother was born in America. She was born in a little town, Fresno, in California in 1924, and she ended up moving over to Japan with her aunt to receive a Japanese schooling and education. This is her story. My Obachan is named Masako Oyanagi. She was staying with her aunt in the mountains of Hiroshima, in the countryside, growing up with an aunt who treated her badly, in her own words. She was very young when she went to Japan, and her aunt was an ikebana sensei, which is a flower arrangement sensei. And she was very cultured in the Japanese way of doing things. However, my bachan was not allowed to be a kid, was not allowed to run around, because my bachan by nature is a little bit loud and sometimes doesn't realize the things she is saying. It was very hard for her to be quiet and good all the time under the watchful and sometimes hateful eye of her aunt. 74 years ago, she was getting on a trolley. She was 21 years old. She was working in the city in Hiroshima, going from Yamanaka in the mountains to go to the city to work. The trolley car that she was about to get onto was very full, and there was a rude man who pushed her off of the trolley car because he felt that he had no room. She was on the floor wearing a white blouse. She was very upset and angry because she couldn't get to work on time. She looked up, and all of a sudden the trolley car she was just standing on bursted into flames. That was when the atomic bomb dropped. She was only 21 years old, and she was already disfigured and scarred. The polka dots on her blouse are still imprinted into her skin today. But because what she was wearing was white, it deflected a lot of the heat. Because she was in the shadow of the trolley car, she survived. She looked up, and everyone was gone. The trolley car was already in flames, and everything was on fire. This is a photo of the train tracks, some of the only things that survived the blast. She followed the train tracks on the way to try to get back to her home. The next day, her head was swollen like a pumpkin. All of her hair had fallen out. It took her 3 weeks to walk back home, during which she found a lady's purse due to her good luck. She was able to buy something to drink, and she could take a trolley home instead of continuing to walk for another half day. She wanted to go to Kabe City Hall, where she hoped that she could find work and hoped she could find people unaffected by the bombs. Now, she didn't tell me this directly. She is unable to tell the stories, I believe, because what she saw that day was so horrific. She, however, has told people on TV, has told interviewers, and my aunts and uncles have been able to tell me some of the things that she saw that day. People without their eye sockets bleeding out of their heads, people completely covered in blood, yet no visible lacerations. At Kabe City Hall, truckloads of black, burned bodies stacked like wood were right in front of her. She fainted, and a kindly City Hall worker brought her back home through the tracks on a wheelbarrow. Due to her good luck, somehow my bachan survived. She had lacerations all over her skin. Her head was already so swollen that she couldn't drink or eat. Her face was so burned and so swollen that she couldn't eat or drink any food. However, a small opening opened up on the left side of her mouth, and a straw was allowed to be passed through so she could drink water. Her aunt gave her no food, afraid of the radiation poisoning. already convinced that she would die in a few days. She had maggots on her wounds, especially around her neck, and she had lost so much weight she could count the ribs through her skin. And her aunt sent her to the bamboo forest by the countryside, away from the house, far away from the relatives, far away from her aunt. And a kindly neighbor brought her musubi, rice balls, so she survived. And she drank water through a straw. She was able to purchase the water, and something inside of her told her not to drink water from the 7 rivers of Hiroshima, an intuition that did save her life. What did she do next? Upon healing, after the war ended, she came back on the first ship to the US. The details here are fuzzy, foggy, because she refuses to really talk about it. The only things I could gather are from my aunts and uncles. She might have come back to the family, and it looks like she settled in West LA. She ended up meeting my grandfather, Michael Minoru Yuzuki, in 1950, moving into a 2-bedroom house in Santa Monica for $10,000, an enormous sum at the time, working as a domestic, and they were the first non-Caucasians to live on the block. There was a large Japanese American community that had settled in West LA, and the remnants are still on Sawtell Boulevard. There were boarding houses that housed people that did not have a place to stay in the Buddhist church, and she ended up being able to make money by washing clothes because she won a washing machine, telling her story on the Art Lineker's house party in 1957. My father told me that he never heard the story from her himself because she never told him. One day they were watching TV, they look up, oh my gosh, Mom's on TV! And they listen and they hear her story, and all I can imagine now, being the descendant of one of the survivors, is if that happened to me today, would I be able to tell this story? Would I be able to go on TV to tell the world, to tell the Americans, my home country, who had bombed my hometown, to tell them the story of how I got these scars and how I suffered? And my answer is maybe not. Maybe the psychological suffering would have been too great. But my grandmother has this kind of perseverance. In Japanese, we call it gamon. And she has this perseverance and this resilience and dedication to her children. And that's why she was able to step out of the psychological horror of retelling the stories of Hiroshima and earned that washing machine. Michael passed away in 1971 from cancer, and she married a man that I call Tomoki-san, or Tomoki-ji-chan. Together, they gave all 4 of their children, who you can see here, the oldest Julie, then Harriet, then Larry, and then my father, Dale. Better childhoods than what they had. All 4 have college educations, 3 with master's degrees. Margaret's hard work, her resourcefulness, determination, gamon, gave her Sansei children a better childhood than what she had. Tachan is now 95 years old.
When everything is wrong,
Yeah.
you cannot do nothing. It was so hard for me to have education. I thought I didn't graduate high school, because I went to Japan, and so that's why I raised in Japan. You don't know, I have hardest time when I was young, I did so many bad things, but now everything is over, and I'm so glad that everything is doing so well. Now everything is well. Wow. No wonder I'm getting old.
You've been saying that, Mom, long time.
My grandma is adorable, I think. She is happy, always smiling, and always gave me Hello Kitty dolls when I was a child that now my little brother Sky plays with. Now, we're going to shift over to Lee Jong-kun, who is another Hiroshima Hikabusha. He was 14 years old when the bomb dropped. For much of his life, he felt that he had to hide two parts of his identity, one being his Korean identity, and the second being his history as an atomic bomb survivor. He said later, as an 88-year-old in an interview with the Japan Times, "I suffered from dual discrimination." Picture. Both of his parents are from the Korean Peninsula. He graduated from Yokohama National School with the highest marks. He landed a very sought-after job in the engine depot of the Hiroshima Railway Bureau, but hid the fact that he was Korean the entire time. He was only 15 at the time when the atomic bomb dropped. At the time, he was on his way to work and from his home village, and he had just crossed the Kojin Bridge near Hiroshima Station, about 1.8 kilometers from the epicenter. Suddenly, he was bathed in yellowish light. He lay down on the ground, covering his ears, eyes, and nose. After a while, he looked up and found that everything was dark all around him. After waiting for more light, he looked around. His lunchbox, which he had placed at his feet upon crossing the bridge, was now 20 feet away. His cap and glasses were gone. He didn't realize his face, neck, hands, and arms were all burned until he took refuge under a bridge and was told his face was red by another survivor. Hugh still went to work. His coworkers put black oil on him from the engine depot, and they thought that they would save him. He remembers crying from the pain. For 4 months, until his burns began to heal, he feared that he would die. His mother, every night, would cry by his bed, begging that someone, some force, would take him out of this world and take him out of his suffering. Each day, he tugged on his hair to see if it would fall out, and he had maggots on the wounds, just like my grandmother, all around his neck. When he finally returned to work, a coworker told him that he might catch the atomic bomb disease. He then quit his job at the engine depot, afraid and angry, and suffering all of this, and suffering also his identity as a hidden Korean Japanese. He quit his job at the engine depot in 1946. He then made ends meet by selling recycled goods. He had 3 daughters, he got married, and in the process, he gradually set aside his memories of the atomic bombing. Later, much later in his life, in 2012, he was asked by the Japanese government to go on a peaceboat voyage throughout different various regions of the world that had suffered greatly because of World War II. And he said yes, because he decided that he wanted others to be aware of the fact that, like I said earlier, it was not just Japanese nationals who suffered from the atomic bomb. This is him, 88 years old, at the same bridge that he had just crossed when he was completely burned by the atomic bomb. Next, a story from a very widely read American novel, Hiroshima. Father Wilhelm Kleinsorg, a Jesuit German priest stationed at a mission house. Before the bomb, he was a weak man. He was resting, reading a magazine in his room. He didn't feel so great, and the bomb struck. Because the mission house had been double braced for earthquakes, it did not topple, and him and his fellow priests received very minimal harm, only small lacerations up his arms, and there was nothing visible until about 2 weeks later. He was an extremely selfless man. Upon collecting his belongings and his papier-mâché suitcase, he went to the place where a lot of the survivors were collecting, and he gave them water, gave them food, and he himself didn't feel that he was suffering very much. However, 2 weeks later, radiation sickness took him. After he got out of the hospital, he ended up re-entering 3 more times. He volunteered, however, to go and do his work despite all of the things he was suffering. He ended up becoming a Japanese citizen and taking the name Father Makoto Takakura, and he ended up never getting over his radiation sickness. By spring 1956, he had completed 400 baptisms and 40 marriages. Even to this day, at his tombstone, there are always fresh flowers. Finally, we have Howard Kakita, who was only 7 years old when the bomb dropped. He lived 0.8 miles from ground zero in Hiroshima, and it knocked him out cold. Here, he is on the right, his grandfather is in the middle, and his older brother, Kenny, is on his left. Miraculously, both of the boys and their grandparents survived the explosion relatively unharmed. The blast sent shards of window glass into their grandmother's skin, and there was a lot of blood, Howard recalled, but she was not seriously injured. As for the boys themselves, they only had small lacerations, similar to Father Wilhelm, on their skin. He remembers a huge cloud of smoke filling the sky. He remembers saying, "The city of Hiroshima, it is burning." After the victory over Japan Day in August 15, 1945, when the emperor gave his address. All the buildings were flattened, only concrete, metal structures remained. They lived in a shack, built in an old raid shelter. They developed serious dysentery and lost their hair, surviving on vegetables and eventually whale blubber distributed by the Japanese government. And he said that was probably the only source of protein we had for a number of months. There were no gourmet meals in those days, but it was something we survived on. War had kept him and his brothers apart from his parents, who were back in America in internment camps, and their younger brother for 7 years. He said that the worst he suffered was the psychological suffering. His mother would often find him screaming in the middle of the night, afraid of red foods, rare steak, tomato sauce, pink grapefruit, all which reminded him of the suffering carnage he had witnessed back in Hiroshima. Upon returning to America, Howard was able to learn English, though it was hard assimilating into the almost all-white community in Southern California, similar to my grandmother. He wants people to realize the horror of atomic war. He feels he owes it to society to at least share his experience and try to mitigate the proliferation of atomic warfare. Howard Kakita went on to have a successful engineering career before retiring 21 years ago. He has been married for over 50 years. He has 2 daughters and a loving wife and 4 grandchildren. Now, he says he loves rare steak. Time magazine did a spread a couple years ago of Hikabusha and their narratives and their stories. I want to share a few with you today. Peace is a funny thing, I think, and peace is something we need to be continually working forward and towards. Today, it is easy to read on the news all of the horrors of the world today, all of the suffering. In China, in Xinjiang province, the Uyghur Muslims and the atrocities that they're facing, all of the civil and human rights violations throughout the world make me feel like I should be doing something always, all the time. But today, 74 years after my grandmother almost died because of an atomic bomb, I realized that peace is something that has to be worked on little by little. It is our #1 priority. Just as my grandmother and these 3 other survivors worked to survive day to day after the droppings of the atomic bomb, they persevered with determination. We also must persevere with determination, working little by little each day towards peace. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mei Yuzuki. Truly moving, wonderful presentation.